7 decades ago, the first television adaptation of Superman arrived. Now, it's time to rocket back to the 1952 to 1958 series Adventures of Superman, starring George Reeves. In this rewatch podcast, my guests and I break down each episode, from its black and white crime drama beginnings to the kid-friendly color seasons, as we celebrate one of the most underrated Man of Steel depictions of all time. Welcome to another exciting episode in the Adventures of Superman. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss Season 1, Episode 14, Treasure of the Incas, is Superman cosplayer Daniel Sanchez. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm feeling very reporter-like tonight.
Yes, you have your glasses, you have your George Reeves style Superman shirt. We're in glorious black and white. We're good to go here.
So, interesting thing about that, when I was a kid, we only had a black and white television. So I did not know for the longest time that there were color episodes. So what you're not seeing, dear viewer, is this is the color George Reeves shirt. What I'm now holding up is a brown replica, which was used in the original filming of the black and white episodes for contrast reasons. But you'll see that's the difference.
Wait, hang on one sec. I'm going, for our YouTube audience who's watching the video of this, I am going to restore your color for a moment here. There we go.
Color. Original Reeves brown.
Very nice. Very cool. No, thank you for sharing that. So for people who follow my other podcast, Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey, you were on fairly recently talking about your experience as a Superman fan, your experience cosplaying as Superman, all the wonderful charity work that you do. We touched on your history with Adventures of Superman. I really encourage people to go check out that episode. It really seemed to resonate with our audience. Very powerful, moving story that you shared with everyone, and I really can't recommend it highly enough. So I hope everyone will go and take a listen or look at that episode. In a moment, I do want to ask you about your history with the show, but let me just give our quick setup here. So again, this is episode 14 of season 1. It aired on December 19th, 1952, written by Howard Green, directed by Tommy Carr. And our synopsis from IMDb this time, I've sort of given up on the DVD synopses because I typically find them lacking. So either I make my own or now we'll pull in from IMDb. While Lois is on her way to an auction featuring South American items, a man asks her to purchase an Inca tapestry for him. Soon after, the man is killed, and the tapestry is stolen from Lois. So she, Jimmy, and Clark follow the murderer to Lima to find the tapestry and catch the criminals behind the murder. So that's the one that we're talking about today. A lot to unpack, as always. Before I ask you about your impressions of this episode, talk to me about Adventures of Superman generally. What role did it play in your Superman fandom as a kid?
It was my entry point. It was the first little boy, big heart, oh my gosh, I love Superman experience that I had was the George Reeves television show. So this is circa 1972. I'm somewhere around 4 years old. And the reason for living during the week is for 3:30 in the afternoon to come and the Adventures of Superman comes on. This was in Atlanta, and in those days there was a show probably has been forgotten by everyone called Hazel, all about the adventures of a single father trying to do his best with his children, and luckily he has this wonderful maid who plays the mother figure, and her name was Hazel, and it was absolute night hall for a child. It was just the thing that was in the way before the Adventures of Superman. But when that first whoosh sound came on, even before the first note of the music, the thrill, the blood pumping that would happen when you just hear whoosh and you knew it was about to start. I very much can appreciate what it was like for the children listening to the radio show in the 40s, because there was nothing like it. And that was my entry point. From that, I wanted to read the comic books. From that, I wanted to learn everything else that there was to know. But it was my first love.
And now I know the answer to this, but for the audience of this podcast, what is your favorite episode from the George Reeves series?
Around the World with Superman, where we're doing spoilers, right? Hopefully, because you'll bring me in for that episode and we can deeply go into it.
I
But there
already
is a
have your name down on the Excel list for that one. Don't worry.
yes, there is a girl who suffers from blindness, and many things happen, but she's deemed inoperable. And there comes a point in the episode where Superman realizes that with his precision, he can be the one to cure her blindness with his heat vision. And when her sight is restored, he flies her to see everything, to show her the world, to show her the colors, to show her the butterflies, to show her the sky. And I just had never before and possibly never since seen a gesture of love for someone simply because they were deserving of it, and to care for someone simply because they were alive. And the way that he did this for her made a lifetime indelible impression to me of this is who Superman is. So the interesting thing is I was a child watching these episodes is that they were not shown in an order, they were all random. And so I had no sense of placement of when or where this episode happened. I just knew that it was the pinnacle of what Superman's heart was.
It really is such a beautiful episode, and we're a ways away from that, obviously, the end of season two. But I do look forward to eventually getting there and to speaking with you about it further. Actually, a question though. So you're watching these as a kid out of order. You have a black and white TV. So even when you're watching the color episodes, you're watching them in black and white.
Mhm.
We've at least touched on it on the show, how there's definitely a shift as we head into the color seasons in terms of the tone and the storytelling and everything. As a kid, like, what did you make of that? Especially if you were bouncing between episodes from different seasons, and was it jarring? I would imagine it would be.
Well, they kept changing Lois's. In my experience, there was no rhyme or reason when you would have Phyllis Coates or Noel Neal. But keep in mind, the era that I grew up in, they would change Darren's on Bewitched, and they would change Wilbur's on Mr. Ed. So this was just something that as a child you go, okay, we don't understand why. I always thought in Bewitched, she just one day wanted a better looking husband, so she just changed him. But the 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 let me tell you, I'm a Phyllis Coates fan through and through. Um, we all love Noelle Neal. She's absolutely fantastic. But I think Phyllis was Lois Lane. And I've heard you talk on previous episodes about how there's not so much the love story dynamic in these first few seasons, especially with Phyllis Coates. And let me tell you that as a child, that was fine with me. I I'm a 4 and 5 year old boy. I don't need to see a drawn out, complex, subtle dynamic between the two of them in the workplace. And in fact, the way that Phyllis treated him with a little bit of disdain and a lot of competitiveness, and she would make the snide remarks and she would give him the cold stares, that fit right into the way girls would treat you at school. They were wanting to beat you on the playground. They were wanting to show you that they were better than you, or at least just as good as boys. And so this was a one-to-one lining up with my own experience. So when I saw this happening to Clark Kent, that was reality. I totally believed that this is how it is when you grow up also. So
No, fair enough.
yeah, but it was just amazing to see the different adventures. And I eventually formed opinions about the different characters. I fell out of love with Jimmy Olsen after a while, I think, because as a child you want to see the young male character be awesome, and so many times he was just kidnap fodder, or he was just there to yell twice as loud as really anyone needed to be talking. And some of his decisions were not great. And meanwhile, I'm reading books like The Hardy Boys, which many of these episodes seem to me to be modeled very much after a Hardy Boys story. The lighthouse episode, the caves. There were a lot of caves. There were so many caves in these episodes, but it was always there's a mystery, and then very quickly you solve it. And it may not have been a great mystery, but that's all right. And Jimmy just didn't seem to be as smart as the Hardy Boys or as Encyclopedia Brown or any of my other childhood, adventure heroes. And he was more in the line of Shaggy to me. So I didn't watch it for him. I watched it for Clark, who was all about the social justice and very much a man who proved that you really can have an effect. Like one man can do something, and Reeves Clark Kent, especially in the first two seasons, was more the hero.
No, absolutely. No, it's great to get your take on all of that. It's really funny because every time a guest expresses a preference for Phyllis Coates over Noel Neal, everyone always kind of brings it up as if it's, maybe, again, we all want to be respectful and all of that. But sometimes it's brought up as like maybe a little bit of a controversial opinion. Every single guest who has addressed it so far has preferred Phyllis Coates. So I think, I think even for myself going in, it's like, I don't know where people kind of land on this, but after having conversation after conversation, I think for us Superman fans, obviously I don't want to generalize, but I think that's a pretty shared viewpoint to have. So certainly one that
Mhm.
I share. And I think this was a perfect episode to have you on for because you mentioned, that competitiveness between Lois and Clark that is on full display in this episode. I would say I think this actually is a good showcase for Jack Larson's Jim Olsen. This episode certainly more so than maybe other ones that you were that you were pointing to. And I do also just want to say that when you mention watching these out of order and dealing with the changing Loises. So for this child of the 90s, the equivalent for me was watching Saved by the Bell. So in the final season of that show, Tiffany Thiessen and Elizabeth Berkley left, and they decided to do a few more episodes, like half a season's worth of episodes. And so they brought in another actress to play a new character named Tori. And when they aired the episodes, as as memory serves, they alternated them. So one week you would be there with our traditional core cast, including Kelly and Jesse. And then the next week they would be gone without any explanation, and Tori would be there. It was just back and forth for this for this final season. And now of course I understood what was going on behind the scenes, but as a kid it was like jarring, maybe too strong a word, but it was definitely felt out of sorts watching it. So I can identify.
Yeah, and especially a kid with a big imagination, you sit around thinking, okay, I missed an episode where the super scientist with the alien machine changed Lois, but one day they'll show that episode and it will make sense. So you fill it in yourself.
Yes. So, Treasure of the Incas. We'll go scene by scene as we typically do on the show, but just big picture, what were your overall impressions and how did this live up to your memory of it? And I don't know how long it's been since you watched this one, but I would be curious, how again what the experience was like now versus the last time you watched it.
So I'm actually tremendously glad you asked me to do this particular episode because I do remember vividly watching it as a child. Have not seen it since I was a child, but because my own heritage is Spanish and Guatemalan, the Guatemalan side, my mother's side, is Mayan. But for a long time, I thought we were Aztec. And so I had a huge love for all things that were, Aztec warrior and the panther gods and all of the, just the culture in general. I thought was really tough and really cool. And so these beautiful title cards that come up at the beginning of the episodes, and then one said "Treasure of the Incas," and I went, "Yes, this is going to be the best thing ever." And I remember that just because I grew up in a house that had all of these Mayan tapestries and napkins, and everything is hand woven and everything is embroidered. And uh, I was just so used to that the very first time in the episode where they actually show you, oh, this is the Inca tapestry, I looked at it and as a little boy, I went, no, it isn't. I don't know who drew that, but that is not. That is not an Inca tapestry. So I made some notes about that. But that was my memory like as a child, and so I thoroughly enjoyed going back as an adult thinking, all right, now that I know what I know about the limitations of production schedules and budgets, and they really did a phenomenal job, all things considered. But it was really nice to bookend it, as it were, and bring my two perspectives together.
Oh, that's great to hear, and I'm excited to compare notes as we get deeper into the episode. So, I guess kind of on the note of the limitations, this is an episode where we have predominantly white actors portraying South American characters. Now,
Mhm.
this is far from the most, egregious instance. In a few episodes, we'll get to Drums of Death, Riddle of the Chinese Jade. There are numerous instances in the show that when different ethnic groups are portrayed, it typically leaves something to be desired. I think that's fair to say, either in terms of the casting or just the depictions, where we often lean into broad stereotypes. And one that even comes to mind for myself from season 2, I'm Italian. We have the Italian diner owner in one of the season 2 episodes, and it's very much like I'm making the meatball sandwich, and it's like, all right. Now,
Yeah.
I bring this up because I just want to at least address it. I'm going to get your take on this. My feeling, my perspective as the host of this, when we talk about these sorts of issues, my I feel that the purpose here is not to ignore or absolve or condemn, but rather to just acknowledge and address, right? So we understand the context, the time in which these things were made, things that were commonplace then that would not be now, rightly so. So it's not that we're here to, sort of, rip these apart, but at the same time, I don't want to gloss over it either, because it is a reality of it. So that's kind of where I land, of acknowledging, but not condemning or absolving. It just, it is what it is. And how do you feel about this?
Well, I mean, I was still glad they made the episode, even as a kid. I was still glad that it was there, and you have to remember that in that era, the whole appeal of showing something like that was exotic is because we knew very little of what it was really like. You could read an Edgar Rice Burroughs novel, or you could, so you can forgive them a lot that they weren't entirely accurate because there was such a huge unknown about it. And if it was a good adventure, sometimes that would be good enough. I don't think anyone ever intended anything harmful. It was just a matter of, we want to tell this story. There's a certain amount of detail that is enough, and let's keep going.
Yeah, well said. Well said. So I would say for myself, as far as other big impressions, I enjoyed this episode well enough. This would not fall in the category of my favorite season 1 episodes, but I don't have the issues with it that I have with some of the other ones that I sort of rated lower. So this is kind of in the middle for me. I think that, like I said, I think it's a great showcase for Jim. He has a lot of funny one-liners and a few really heroic moments where he
Mhm.
steps in to try to defend Lois. So I appreciated that. That competition, that rivalry between Clark and Lois is on full display, although it's pretty one-sided in this episode, right? It's a lot of Lois's frustration over Clark being there and being part of this. And I did feel a little frustrated with Lois at points because she was really so dismissive and discounting the theories that Clark had cultivated that actually proved to be right. And had she gotten out of her own way and listened, she would have gotten to the bottom of it. And obviously we need to have our story and we need to, we need to get to the climax of it and everything. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know how great Lois came off here. I was a little bit, this is not the first time I've been a little frustrated with Lois. The rescue episode was a big example of that. And we were kind of getting into that territory here as well. But yeah, at the same time, I definitely still enjoyed it overall.
Yeah, and going back to that, my experience was watching them all jump around and be random. You watch their dynamic change for me day to day for no reason. So you really didn't have a chance to examine why. You just, again, like going back to elementary school, there are some days that girls are just really annoyed with you and you don't know why. They just are. So I just I gave it the same blanket of explanation, I suppose. But
Fair
I, but
enough.
I will agree that sometimes in this episode, if Lois had just decided to work with Clark, then many things could have been very different.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we'll give a quick guest star alert here. So here were our major guest players. We had Hal Gerard as Professor Lavera. We had Leonard Penn as Pedro Mendoza, or Scarface. Juan Duval as Dr. Cuesta, and the MVP utility player, brother of director Tommy Carr, Stephen Carr, as Don Anselmo. This was another instance where he had a very prominent role. He pops up in a dozen or more of these season 1 episodes, always as a different character. And sometimes they're little bit parts, and other times he gets more of a showcase. And this definitely falls into that latter category. I've said this before. The first time I watched the show, I was not tuned into the fact that he kept popping up as these different players. Maybe a testament to his acting. We'll give him that. But now as I'm watching it again, of course, I haven't been checking ahead of time. I'm just watching each one. And when he showed up, I was like, oh, there he is again. So again, MVP utility player on the show.
Yeah, like Richard Donner's brother. He's in there.
He's there.
Yep.
All right. So let's head into our scene by scene approach to Treasure of the Incas. So we open on the streets of Metropolis outside this auction on South American antiquities. Lois gets out of her car. She's walking in. She's stopped by this man on the street. He doesn't give her his name yet. We'll learn later he's Professor Lavera. And he asks her to go in and bid on this tapestry for him. He can't go. It's too dangerous for him to go in. So he hands her $1,000. She can bid up to $1,000 to obtain this piece. I mean, even today, if a stranger handed you $1,000, that'd be a lot. 70 years ago, I mean, that's kind of an astounding sum.
I looked it up. Do you want to know how much it is?
Oh, please, yeah.
$11,289.43.
Yeah, that was something. That was really something. So, Lois's reaction, definitely tracks. And he says to her, he's like, you look like one who can be trusted. Which, she is, but that's quite a leap of faith to take with someone you don't know at all.
And for Lois to do it.
Yes.
I just assumed it was her reporter's curiosity, the same killed the cat curiosity that she always has that made her do it. But still, a heck of a thing to happen both ways.
Yeah, and I'm sure she figured she would get the story right afterward, but she doesn't have the opportunity because right after she goes in, our scarred man shows up behind Lavera on the street and walks him into this alley. And, they go behind the corner so we don't see it, but he kills Lavera. Again, this is season 1. People die in season 1.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this was actually fairly tame for the show. I mean, we've seen people get shot and whatnot, but this, kind of hit it behind the corner here.
Yeah, and you're not exactly sure. Again, as a kid, you see around the corner, you hear a thump, and then you just see a hand fall, and you don't know. Maybe he's just unconscious, and not until later do you get the phone call when it's Kent and he's at the morgue, and you go, oh.
Well, and even before that, because when we see one of the figures walk back, but we only see the feet, right? So they don't actually show you Scarface's face walking out. And for a brief moment, I again, forgetting, my initial viewing of this a couple of years ago, at first I was like, oh, did Vera get the jump on the guy? And clearly not. But, they did play with that little mystery for a few seconds there. And then I keep calling him Scarface. We'll learn his name is Pedro Mendoza. But he stops Lois outside of the antique auction and purports to be a friend of Professor Lavera. And Lois, very quick, she's like, well, I didn't know his name. He never told me his name. And he's like, I'll take this, I'll take this and give it to him. And Lois really, really holds her ground. She's like, well, if he wants it, I'm Lois Lane. I'm at the Daily Planet. He can come and get it. I really I liked this back and forth. And I liked how resolute she was in being so steadfast and refusing to hand it over.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you're really proud of her in that instance. She was definitely General Sam Lane's daughter. You are not who you say you are. It doesn't take my full reporter radar to pick up on that. So she knew.
Yes. Oh, for sure. So we cut to the Daily Planet and Lois, Clark, and Jim are in Clark's office studying this tapestry. And this is, again, I think one of the one of those Jim lines where he's like, it's got a hole in it. And they're like, well, it's a cutout, Jim. And he's like, well, it's still a hole. He's not wrong.
Nope. Nope. But it also was not a tapestry. It was on paper.
Yes, I was curious about that. So there's that aspect. And also, this is the comic book collector in me, but I felt like Lois was really manhandling this this rare, valuable relic as well.
Yeah. And I was all set. I'd made these notes. I was all set to just blast the fact that this entire episode, they run around with this piece of paper calling it a tapestry. And then later in the episode, they switch it. It's an actual tapestry.
Oh yeah, that's
So
right.
whatever shooting schedule or production schedule they had, or maybe the prop maker was whatever, they just went with it. And our first three exposures to this Inca tapestry is what amounts to what looks like a child's painting on one side of a big piece of paper. And even as a child, I thought that's not an Inca tapestry, because let me explain. So, for those people who may not know, the Incas are out of Peru. And so, a lot of this episode is based on the city of Lima in Peru. So, if you think of South America, it's about one third of the way down on the left hand side, right by the coast of the Pacific Ocean. So, there's Mexico, you go further south. There's Guatemala, you go further south. There's Panama, where I was born, you go further south. You get into South America, you go about a third of the way down. Now you're into almost, Tarzan type territory of South America. And so think of the art that would be there. If you Google Inca tapestry, you'll see that there are many more border decorations. There are stair step motifs. There are many more animals. It's more of a hieroglyph form of storytelling. It's what you would think of if you think of movies like El Dorado and the Lost City of Gold, and the way that all of the armaments have this jagged, like it's Emperor's New Groove. It's that kind of a look. And you look at this episode, and it's like a child tried to draw some sort of pack animal, and it had a head and it had four legs, and the stars that went around were American stars. They were the five-pointed stars. And I literally turned my head when I was a kid from the television to my own wall and saw, that this would. And so, because as a child you fill in your own adventure, I thought, oh, it's a trick. It's a trick. They sold her something. It's not really one. They'll find out that it's not one. So I kept expecting that moment where someone realizes that. Nope, nope. It was just a half done prop, and and that's all there was to it. So different experience.
No, that's the thing, because right, virtually any other kid watching that, right, wouldn't have that connection point and would just kind of go along with it. But you knew better, and you actually had something authentic to be able to compare it to. So, but I appreciate your headcanon, and and giving them the benefit of the doubt. It's like, oh, this is going somewhere, and it's like, unfortunately not. But
Yeah. But like I said, you go with it. It's there for the adventure, and so the suspension of disbelief is more fun.
So they're, comparing notes, talking about how odd the situation is and what happened to this guy, and all of that. And, Lois makes a remark about something rotten in Denmark, right? A phrase which I will admit I was not familiar with, but I did a little quick search and I educated myself. And then
Shakespeare.
Yeah. And then Clark turns it and says something rotten in Peru, which Jim thinks is hilarious. Really, he really likes that joke.
Yep. Yeah, you think he got paid by the laugh, the way he threw himself into that one.
Yes. So, Lois and Jim leave, and Clark gets a call. He's called down to the morgue, which we find out in the next scene when Lois is in her office and she gets a call from Clark. He says, I'm at the morgue. Professor Lavera was killed, and to come down and bring the tapestry, right? But before Lois can go to meet Clark, Mendoza shows up at Lois's office and knocks her out and takes the tapestry.
Mm-hmm.
So we then find Clark out on the street in front of the morgue, impatient as he always is. The George Reeves Clark is a very impatient man. He does not like to wait around. He's checking his watch, walking back and forth. He uses, at a minimum, his X-ray vision, but it seems that there's a bit of telescopic vision involved here as well. I don't know quite how far the morgue is supposed to be from the Daily Planet, but at some distance. So I think we had a little bit of telescopic vision going on there too.
That's how I took it. Yeah, that he looked halfway across the city to find out why Lois was not here.
Yeah, which I like that. Now, this leads to a real standout moment, for better or worse, in this episode where Clark runs into the alley to change into Superman. And, this is footage we've seen in various episodes of him going in and out of in the alley as Clark out of Superman. But the component they add here is that there's a police officer who sees Clark run into the alley and sees Superman fly out. What did you make of this?
At first I thought, oh, that's it, the jig's up. But then I realized, well, he only saw the back of a guy running into the alley. So I I don't know why they felt the need to put that in there at all, except just to provide just a little bit of drama of, oh, you got to be careful. But yeah, I mean, it went nowhere. It didn't amount to anything later. It was just a little moment of, there are other people on the street in the city. So just to remind you of that.
Yeah, that's the thing. I go back and forth on that little bit because I do appreciate that as much as we're seeing our stock footage of Clark, it's like, hey, there is other stuff going on. There are other people here. And to your point, because I was thinking about this, it's like, yeah, what did this guy really see? What would he be able to tell somebody, right? Yeah, he saw the back of a guy in a suit and a hat running in, right? That doesn't give away Clark's identity. But the other thing I liked about it was we've been talking about this in various episodes, this whole notion of, do the people of Metropolis think that Superman has a dual identity? And why would they think that he has a dual identity? And something like this actually goes a long way towards supporting any belief that the citizens of Metropolis might have, right? If this cop, and I'm sure there are other instances of this where people might be like, hey, we saw this guy run into an alley. They can't identify Clark, but they know that some guy went into an alley and then Superman came out. So
Mhm.
it works on a few levels. It was interesting / surprising that there is no follow up to it. It's just like this random little bit, but I did appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, again, like these adventure stories are every now and then supposed to make you go, uh oh, as if something could happen here, and that was just one of those little moments. It did make you think that for 1 second. So, it was what it was.
For sure. So Superman flies to Lois's office, helps her up, gets her situated. She starts explaining, kind of what's been going on, and she catches herself. She's like, "Oh, you don't know about any of this." He's like, "No, Kent briefed me." And she asks, if Clark learned anything at the morgue, and so Superman shares what Clark learned, which is that the man was Lavera, and he was this professor at the University of Lima. So right now, Lois knows where she needs to go. Of course, Superman tries to keep her out of it. He's like, why don't you let Kent handle this one? But this is really now the beginning of this thread here in this episode where she's like, no, like this is my story, and I'm going to follow this myself, which leads us to the sole appearance of Perry White in this episode. Just one scene here
Hmm.
where Lois is talking about making these travel arrangements that Perry needs to okay. And he's very resistant. What was your take on how this back and forth played out?
I could not believe the boldness of Lois when she just announces she's already bought Pan Am tickets. So I'm assuming she did that with Daily Planet money. And Perry, of course, is righteously upset. Like, you did what? And then, she convinces him that it's important enough. And not only does he tell her, take Jimmy with you, as if, let's add child endangerment to this to this plan. But then she's so happy about it. She kisses Perry on the lips. That was the one that I went, wow. I didn't see that response coming. But later when you go back and you look at that, you think Perry never said take Clark.
Right.
And only as an adult do you realize, well, that's for the sake of the story because the writers had to create the scenario, and so therefore, but in in what I would imagine the way the Daily Planet functions, Perry would have said, well, I'm not letting you just fly off to Peru, a woman by herself. You're taking Clark, this big, strong man who's proven himself time and time again. You're not leaving unless you take Clark. But that's not what he did. So you get the sense of, okay, this is going to be somewhat of a Jimmy showcase. Let's just see what happens.
For sure. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, right? From a story perspective, like it doesn't make any sense. It's like bring Jimmy for protection. It's like, well, who's going to protect Jimmy?
Right.
Um, but the kiss was great. It was funny because you see this back and forth, and again, he relents, and she talks about how I have to go home and pack. He's like, you mean you haven't packed yet? And she gives him that kiss, and you see just for that brief moment the slightly softer side of this version of Perry White, which we don't get much of on this series. So. A brief but effective scene for John Hamilton's Perry White. Then we get some stock footage of an airplane and people disembarking. And we get our title card telling us that we are in Lima, Peru. And then we
Mm-hmm.
have Jim and Lois coming out of their hotel. This is, I thought the funniest, best Jim scene of the episode, his quote unquote his brand of Spanish, Mr. Senor. What do you make of this? I thought this was so funny.
Oh my. Well, again, I brought my own culture and heritage to it. And when they first walk out of that little cantina or place that they're in before they step out onto the streets, um, and Lois was, telling him that the Spanish conversation he tried to have inside didn't exactly pan out, and Jimmy goes, well, it was a crummy hotel, so they speak crummy Spanish. And I just laughed like, here's here's the American blaming his poor Spanish on the locals. And of course, I knew because my mother was Guatemalan and my father is Spanish that the dialects can be wildly different. The language can be different. The meanings can be different. The words to describe things can be very different. So of course, I knew that in Peru, their version of Spanish is not going to sound like the Spanish that Jimmy knows. So I was at once sort of like half rolling my eyes about it, but then half like, no, that's actually funny. So
Well, again, even funnier when you find out what Jimmy's brand of Spanish actually consists of, right? Because he goes up to the cab driver and he says, "Mr. Senor,"
right.
and then of course his first question is "Habla español?" So he asks the driver if he speaks Spanish, and then once he gets confirmation of that, he's very excited. He's like, "Okay, the cab driver speaks Spanish." Then he launches into, "Could you?" He says, "Could you comunicado?" Two of us to I think does he say El Capitan to the
Yeah.
de la Policia? He gets enough of it there, right, where the cab driver understands. But
Yeah.
you learn what his brand of Spanish consists of, and it's a lot of English, and yeah, but very funny. Yeah, he had
Yeah.
some good bits in this episode.
And you notice the leeway that Lois will give Jimmy, whereas she gives none to Clark. If Clark had pulled that same attempt, she would have looked at him like, you are the world's most useless man. But with Jimmy, it's, you did great. Let's go. So very, very telling.
Yes, very. Yeah, I know, very much so. So we get to El Capitan de la Policia, and the police captain says he'll check the plane passengers, right, to see if anyone matches the description of this scarred man. And he does point Lois and Jim to Dr. Cuesta, the president of the university. He's like, you should talk with him. I'll give him a call first. And before they depart, he kisses Lois's hand, and
Mhm.
Jim's eyes just about pop out of his head. It's the craziest thing he's ever seen, and it'll happen again in the next scene when they meet Lavera's assistant. So yeah, it definitely made a big impression on Jim. This custom of kissing the woman's hand.
Yeah, I remember the first time I saw that scene, the way that the police capitan was dressed reminded me so much of Zorro and the bad guys on Zorro, because they had the diagonal sashes and they had the military accoutrements and they had the dark suits, but with the gold. And I just, was transported back, and so a lot of the love in the episode, previously, 10 seconds ago, I'm rolling my eyes at Jimmy, but then I see this guy and I'm like, oh yeah. So it sort of got me leaning back in a little bit, just to think, all right, here's where the episode really starts. Here's where the good stuff is going to happen. And I did think that is this going to be, he's going to woo her, or does this kiss on the hand lead somewhere? Is this going to be an issue when Clark comes, because Clark always comes? So yeah, I found that really interesting. That hooked me right back in.
Yeah, I too thought that this might be setting up some sort of romantic hint, or something that might trigger something in Clark, and obviously we don't get there, but yeah, definitely made note of it just as Jim did. So then we go to the university, and they're greeted by Don Anselmo. This is again the Stephen Carr character, Lavera's assistant, who brings them in to meet Dr. Cuesta. And just as they're about to debrief him on everything, they find out that their countryman has already done that. So we cut over to Clark sitting there in the corner, and of course, this sets Lois off. That now Clark says that the chief sent him, but I think
Mhm.
it's fair to say he took this upon himself. I can't imagine Perry okaying further expenses.
I I've sat there thinking, and even as a child, and I would talk about this, as you do when you have friends in the neighborhood and you just sit around all summer and you talk about Superman, and like, During these moments, did he even take a plane, or did he just fly over as Superman? And he somehow is going to have a cover story of why he didn't need to buy a plane ticket, because for him to be there already would almost hint that by the time he found out about all this, he had no choice but to just fly over as Superman. And he always had that half smirk of, you know, come on, kids, you know, I just flew over here as Superman.
I agree with everything except that he would have a cover story, because this version of Clark, like literally what he says to Jim, he goes, Jim, when I'm in a hurry to get someplace, I really fly. Like he makes no, there's like
Nope,
no
nope.
effort, no effort to be like, oh, Superman tipped me off and I was able to catch a flight. Like there's none of that, which there's something very endearing to me about his almost, lack of regard for his own secret and the way he just kind of leans into it, and is almost so in your face about it that it works in its own weird way, where it's like, I think if he did try to come up with these lame excuses, people would see through that more. But he throws in these lines like this that, of course, are a wink to the audience. But for the other characters, like for whatever reason, they don't, they just they don't see through it. It's this weird effect.
Yeah, and you know, and you can probably dig way too deep into the psychology of it and think, you know, does this hint at he really does think that he's superior in the way that he doesn't feel that they're going to catch on, and he can just stand there and smirk and it'll all be, you know, uh, a non-issue? Maybe.
Maybe. I think if we were doing really a deep psychological dive, I think there might be something to that, in all honesty.
I mean,
Perhaps.
because as we know from the way that the Superman and Lois dynamic continues into the future with other actors and other stories and so on, like, he eventually just falls back to just like he decides it's okay if Lois thinks she's crazy, you know. So I don't know, maybe. I
I
mean,
know.
in these days, it's so that the kids can be in on the joke. And so we'll leave it with that innocent intent. But every now and then you think, well, actors, they need to make their jobs interesting. So perhaps they infuse their performances with certain attributes, and who knows what may have been part of that.
Yeah, for sure. And interesting to ponder, if nothing else. So the scene continues, and now the pieces are starting to come into place, right? Dr. Cuesta retrieves another tapestry from his safe and explains that the one that was stolen is a key, right? When you lay it on top of this one, that hole that Jim was so fixated on, that star cutout, will point to this buried Inca treasure. Now, as he's going through all of this, we get a number of cuts to to the assistant, the Stephen Carr character. So there's really no mystery here about who's involved in this plot, because we
Mm-hmm.
get so many cuts and so many intent looks from him, and he's clearly taking very paying very close attention when Cuesta is entering the combination on the safe and all of that. So the pieces for us as well are starting to fall into place.
Yeah, I mean, it was Scooby Doo level. You know who the villain is. I mean, the way that they had him do his facial expressions, and he was clearly spying on the safe combination, and you know that was pretty the right amount of telegraphing to the kids. Watch this guy.
Yes. And then he proceeds to offer his car to Lois and Jim while they're there. And Clark, Clark is quick to say that things are getting clearer, right? He doesn't explain exactly what he means by that, but he's starting to figure things out. And Lois gets one of those digs in there where she says something to the effect of like, "Well, I wish we were all as bright as you," or something like that, right?
Hmm. Yeah, even to, she tells him not to take any wooden pesos, which is such a just a mean thing to say. But again, very Sandlot, very elementary school, very just. Oh, I thought of one more, and so I'm going to give it to you. This is also the scene where the first time the tapestry is a tapestry.
Yeah, at least they got it right by that scene. And well, the
Hmm.
dig about the wooden pesos, and it's like she had already left the room, and she comes back in, and she's just kind
Hmm.
of leaning on the door as she says it. I like the physical bit there. But yeah, I mean, like really digging in. Jim had another great line where he's like, "Me, I feel like I'm on a merry-go-round." Like this poor kid.
Yeah, yeah, and see, and then, again, as a kid, I'm like, yep. Now we're back to the Jim. That's not very much help here. He's just confused.
Yes. From there, we go back to the police station, and the captain has a few photos to show Lois and Jim and the assistant who's there. So he's now, clued into everything that's going on. And Lois identifies the man with the scar, who the police captain says is Pedro Mendoza, very unsavory character. Jim, another one of these lines. He's sure. What does he say? He sure has a mean puss. That's that's
Hmm.
that's Jim's assessment of the character. So, the case is starting to break here. It's like this is a major lead for them. But Anselmo is like, well, while the police are working on this, how about I drive you around the countryside? And of course, he's asking Lois specifically, but Jim is quick to be like, that'd be great.
Hmm.
And Lois is sort of keeps him at bay, and she's like, well, I'll let you know in the morning, and all of that. So the next morning, I guess she has decided to go along, and she and Jim are getting in the car. And this is when Clark shows up. And this was the scene that I think really, really kind of bugged me and made me a little mad at Lois, right? Because he spent the whole rest of the day and night in the library, right? Reading up on the culture and these treasures and the geography. And, it's not like they have no idea, right? Because they know where that cutout was on the one tapestry, right? So, sort
Hmm.
of using your memory and imagination to overlay it over Questa's tapestry, it's like, well, you have maybe some idea. And so he
Hmm.
identifies a town, Madeira, where in the foothills where the treasure could be. At
Hmm.
least it's something.
Right. Yeah. And Lois had no respect that Clark put in all that work, like a real reporter would. And at that point, you wonder, like, what's the competition over the byline here? Because why can't she say, you know what? Even if I invite Clark to come with us and I just use him for his information, and later I snake the byline anyway, it's still in her own Machiavellian self interest to invite Clark along, but she would rather keep him out of the car and just shut him down entirely. This guy who's flown all the way over, So yeah, that's one where you. But Phyllis sells it though because she doesn't make it seem like it's just furthering this scenario that like she sells it like she has an emotional reason that she's treating Clark this way. She was such a good actress. So it leaves you sort of with this question mark of, okay, I don't know why she continues to do that, but she's going to get herself in trouble again because it's her own fatal flaw that this is how she gets in her tough spots. If she had been more of a colleague, then and you got to think too that later when things go wrong, they could have gone much worse. So it's not just oh oops, slight error in judgment. No, I mean Jimmy could have died. There was some real danger later. So
Yeah, I mean, she's real snide when she says to Clark as they're driving off, "Thanks for the geography lesson, Clark." And I think the thing about it too is, again, I think in fairness to Lois, maybe the aspect of the byline, though that's not said explicitly, right? But she says it's my story, so presumably she has that in mind. And also, we know what her reaction was when Perry said, take Olson for protection, right? And just sort of this whole implication, like she's a woman, she can't protect herself. So I'm sure that's kicking around too, where she already relented and allowed Jim to come. And it's like, from her perspective, again, we kind of surmise Clark took this upon himself, but from her perspective, it's like, well, geez, like, Perry had to send yet another person. I can't do my job by myself. So that's all well and good. Now go ahead.
no, I'll buy that. That's what she was feeling.
So it tracks to an extent. I guess. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that is enough. As I'm kind of convincing myself, maybe that's enough. Because what I was gonna say is, I would have appreciated if there was maybe a little bit more antagonism or ribbing from Clark's side. Like, I think what kind of bugged me about this episode a little bit was just it felt so one sided, right? Like, I feel like Clark is coming off as pretty reasonable and generous in terms of what he's doing, and she's just like brushing him off. Whereas if there was a little bit more friction kind of from both ends, I feel like I would have bought it a little bit more.
Yeah, yeah. Again, watching these out of order, you just assume, "Oh, I missed an episode. They had some sort of fight. There's some reason. This is a carryover from something." But you've been doing them in order. I'll defer to you of whether you think there was a linear intent.
Well, that's the thing. Like we've mentioned in these episodes that they didn't air in the order in which they were shot, right? They were shot in batches of like 4 or 5 episodes at a time, and they would do, all the Perry White scenes together. And so, regardless of how you watch them, I don't think there's really any way in this first season to really discern a true, narrative thread or anything like that. So it's frustrating in a certain sense, but also freeing in a way as well. It's like you really just take each one of these things kind of in a vacuum. Like it just sort of
Hmm.
is what it is. Each little short movie, short film, as it were. So we follow Lois and Jim and Anselmo in this very long drive in the desolate countryside here, and it's hot and they're uncomfortable. And eventually he stops and kicks them out of the car and points a gun at them. He's like, "This is where you get out." So
Hmm.
now he reveals, his true intentions, and this is where I felt Jim had one of his best moments where he really sprang into action and jumped on top of him, and they rolled down the hill a bit, and then Lois tussled with him, and eventually was kind of thrown to the ground, and he drives off. But yeah, I thought Jim came off great here. Lois too. I mean, like they fought, they made an effort.
Hmm. Yeah, I even made a note, like, good for Jimmy. He stuck up for Loris. He got in there. But again, this is what I was saying a second ago. Of this guy pulled out a gun. He could have just not said a word and shot them, and Clark would have later found them, and it could have all been horrible, and it would have been Lois's fault. So that's those things that uh, you don't really think about in the moment, maybe when you're young, but upon rewatch, you do notice. But I got a little nostalgic for the fact that the way that Phyllis Coates jumped on the back of Scarface was very similar to the Margot Kidder fight in the diner when she defended Clark by jumping on the back. So Phyllis did it first.
Yeah, no, but that's a great reference for sure. So they decide to follow the car. They're gonna follow. They're gonna walk it, and they're gonna follow the tire tracks. I mean, again, I think this is probably another instance where the sensible thing, even though I guess they'd been driving a long time, right? It probably would have taken them a while to get back, but they probably should have just turned around and went back. But instead, they decided to follow, and we'll see the trouble that gets them in. But again, Jim was the MVP here, where she asks, like, "Are you with me?" And he's like, "Well, I told the chief, I wouldn't let you out of my sight." And then
Hmm.
I'm jumping ahead for a second, but when they're tied up in the cave, chained, and the dynamite's about to go off, he's like, "Well, kept my word to the chief. Like I
Hmm.
stayed with you to the end." I mean, Jim really, I know I keep saying it, but he really was my MVP in this episode. So many
I'll give
great
it to
moments.
him. Yeah, I'll definitely give him everything he earned on this one. He was brave. He was loyal. He exhibited the thing that, as a boy, you want to see in that kind of a character. Like if he were that all the time, then he'd be, yeah, you're Hardy Boys material. You're the guy who I can get behind every single time. So yeah, shining moment, absolutely.
I feel like what this episode I think did really well with Jim was that I think it reconciled and balanced a lot of the different versions of the character where there are instances where he is a goof, right? And played for laughs, like with Mr. Senor and all of that. But he also proves himself to be heroic and, you know, capable to an extent. I mean, they still still not enough to win the day, but you get to see different sides. So he's not totally a joke. He's also not, he's not the hero of the story, but you kind of get different sides. So I thought this episode really treated him well. You got some of the best flavors of Jimmy Olsen.
Yeah, he did. And also to have him be, so far out of his element. Like he didn't know very much at all about his surroundings or what the right thing to do was. So he really just went with the core of the little bit that was Jimmy, and that we got to see, okay, when all he has is that, what is he? Well, he's really loyal. He loves Clark and Lois. I mean, he'll do anything for either of them. And we saw, oh, okay, so that's that Tony Stark thing, like, strip away the armor. What are you? We'll take, like, what's at the center of Jimmy. We got to see it.
For sure. So they follow the tire tracks, and it eventually leads them to your earlier point, a cave.
A cave. A cave. There must have been some near the lot that were just wonderful to film in, and they just wrote wrote the scripts to. Okay, and in this one, there's a cave.
Yeah, caves really do get a lot of play. I've not been keeping count, but when you mentioned it, it definitely, made me think back. And it's like, yeah, there are a bunch that have their climax, their final showdown in a cave, including this one. Jim says it's darker than the tunnel of love in there, and they make their way in and instantly apprehended. Once again, Jim tries to fight. He gets knocked down. They get chained up, and on Anselmo and Mendoza, they plant and light some dynamite. There's one wall standing between them and this treasure. Oh, I didn't mention this, but when we had the debrief scene with Cuesta at the university earlier on, we got the backstory that Lavera wanted to find these treasures to share with the people, right? He was going to donate it to the government to be distributed to the needy and the poor. So very altruistic. And obviously these guys have the opposite intention. So they light this dynamite and head out. I did like. I think there was a bit of a continuity error, right, in terms of where they place the dynamite and then where we see it later. But when we see it on the ground, the cord is in the shape of an S.
Yeah. Yep. It sure is. Yeah, and it's your old school, Wile E. Coyote stick of dynamite, but they did the chord in an S.
Yeah, so that was a nice touch. And Lois and Jim think that they're at their end, and then they hear, what we hear as we're watching. It's the saddest, the wind of as Superman is flying.
Yeah, and Lois is so used to hearing it. Like you see Phyllis Coates' face light up, and she goes, "It sounds like." So for all of her, how do I keep getting myself into these situations? You really felt the relief. It was palpable with Phyllis's performance of, "Oh, thank God, I hear that noise."
One of the other things I was thinking with this episode, this is very light on Superman action. I mean, we really just
Hmm.
had that one moment earlier on where he flies to the office after she's been knocked out, and then this quick rescue here, and we don't even get a tussle with the bad guys the way we normally do. Superman shows up and he throws the dynamite towards them, and there's this very quick line that I feel like was just like thrown in there. Maybe it was even thrown in after,
Hmm.
because yeah,
Hmm.
where he's like, "Oh, that trapped them. I'll get them later." I feel like that was an after the fact addition. I feel like and this season one Superman, I feel like he just chucked the dynamite at those guys and was ready to be done.
That is how it looked, because he didn't even glance behind him. He knew the two bad guys were running that way, meaning behind his back, away from him. So he just takes the dynamite, basically throws it in their general direction without looking. And you see an explosion. They're still upright, they're still running, sort of, but then you see smoke and some amount of rock fall. Now, you don't know, did it fall behind them? Is this just, did they cut the scene before the entire tunnel that they were in collapsed and crushed them? You know, and so I'm totally with you that at some point somebody stopped the filming on set right then and said, "Oh, we need to say something to the kids about how they're not dead." So it was definitely jammed in there really quick. But Reeves, spend like 2 seconds. Don't spend too long on it. But say he's not dead, kids.
Yeah, don't make a meal out of that line. Just throw it in real quick.
Right? Yeah. Just throw it in. You know, or you could read it as it was. He felt it was important that he explained to Lois, "I didn't just kill those two men." So
There is, we talk about this all the time, right? Not just in the context of this show, but if you're a Superman fan, a fair amount of suspension of disbelief, especially with the dual identity. This is an example of an episode where I feel like it really pushes at the fact that Superman happens to be there as well. And Lois says, like, "How did you find us?" And he makes a remark about, like, "Clark told me that you were going to this town of Madera." Now, this again, I don't mean to nitpick, but we're here to unpack the episode and talk about it and share our thoughts and questions. So I think what two things kind of I bump up against here. One, again, is just this coincidence that Superman happened to be there, but like, it is what it is. But the bigger thing for me is what clued Clark into the fact that Lois was in danger.
right. And how did he tell Superman?
Well, that too. Yeah, I know. Exactly. Well, the same thing too when Superman is in the office with Lois and he's like, "Oh, Kent filled me in." It's like, when, how, but at least there it's like, okay, they're in Metropolis, whatever. But yeah, here it's like, how did Clark get in touch with Superman? And again, but how did Clark know? I mean, presumably something's happening off screen. Maybe the police uncovered some connection between the professor's assistant and Mendoza, or so, I mean, I don't know. Like, you're not given anything. You got to really kind of fill in the blanks on your own. But it's just one of those things where it's like, why would he think that she was in danger and he needed to go after her? Based on what we were shown, I don't know that that necessarily tracks, unless I'm glossing over something.
Well, I mean, I'm sure had they cared to write the explanation, they could have shown Clark did some sort of investigating, found some piece of evidence that connected everything, and somehow knew uh, which way the car went. Based on the conversation that they told him they were having in the car of, Clark, we're going to this place. Um, but, I guess Superman got worried enough after a certain amount of time and he just went to go check in costume. And um, I will say that I loved the physicality of when Reeves arrived and he did the landing, so you hear the whoosh, right, the noise, but then there's also the reverse noise of when he lands that we all know and love. It's when he comes in through the window. It's when he lands feet first. It's like that, it's that other noise. But Reeves doesn't just land and look around and, he lands and runs full speed to the cave opening. I mean, the guy looked like a linebacker. He wasted no time. And when he burst through the wall, you got to kind of love him because some of that's paper mache and it's very light, but he's got to make it look like it wasn't. But he almost always trips because it's always sort of underfoot, and you give him a pass on it, because I've done some things and it's not always easy to make gravity look like it isn't. So, but even after he bursts through the wall, he has this great way of turning his head with his entire torso and then seeing where he needs to go. And then he truly just leaps into action. So when he landed in front of Lois and Jimmy, like, he wasted no time. These were people he loved, and he didn't just make a big show of it. It was, there's dynamite, I'm going to throw it over there, I'm going to break their chains, and he just did it in this really manly, super kind of a way. I think that, like, even though we didn't have the minutes, the screen time that we might have liked to have had of Superman in costume, what he did with that 25 seconds was a really powerful exhibition of Superman. It's like we got to see the elephant at the circus. This was the power of him, and you didn't forget that.
Well said. And it's one of these things where we're fortunate now when we watch Superman and Lois, or we watch Man of Steel, or whatever, any the modern tellings in terms of the spectacle and the special effects and what's able to be realized on screen, uh, and all of that. But you look at something like this, and it's so simple, right? But he, to your point, like, he sold it, and he had that physicality, and he had that presence that made you feel like you were watching Superman,
Mm-hmm.
without all of the bells and whistles and everything that you have now. And that's sort of that ineffable quality that he had, that it's, you can't just put anyone in that costume, right? But he made it work, and I agree. And even in an episode like this, you don't get a ton of Superman action, but what you do get, like, he makes it count, and it's enough to sort of kind of hold you over to the next week, I suppose.
Yeah, and you appreciate too that he breaks their chains and the dynamite's exploded. He explains that the bad guys aren't really dead, and Lois and Jimmy stand up and they dust themselves off, and the gratitude in Phyllis Coates's eyes when she looks up at Superman is real. And I was taking screenshots on my iPad as I was preparing for this episode, and I zoomed in and I thought, wow, like, if you had known as a kid, you could have done the meme of, I just want someone to look at me the way Felix Coates looks at George Reeves.
Very true. No, that is very true. And then we get to our final scene outside the hotel as Lois and Jim are getting in the cab to go back to the airport. She has softened now towards Clark. There's no apology though, or anything like that. No acknowledgement that he was right, but she has at least softened towards him. And it mentions how, there were only 2 seats left, and He's like, well, there are other ways to get back, and she's like, well, if you had wings, you could fly. And of course, we get that final, kind of wink to the audience, so to speak, where he's like, come to think of it, that's not a bad idea.
Hmm.
And we're out, and that's our episode.
Except I had a different take on that last bit because I
Oh,
wrote it down word for word. What Lois said was, "Sorry, we took the last two tickets," and she just like stared at him, and I thought she's just gonna leave him there and not feel bad about it. So even knowing the little bit that she does know that somehow Clark told Superman, "Go save Lois and Jimmy," she still doesn't feel enough appreciation for Clark to say, "We'll wait for the next plane so we can all go together."
oh yeah, no, that's not even. It's not even. I don't think that even
No,
crossed her mind.
no, no. She just leaves him in Peru.
But now, wait. In fairness, she did tell him that she would tell Perry to expect Clark. So
Right.
I don't know how that helps Clark, but but at least there's that.
I don't know, but I think like if you'd wanted to end it on a bit of a laugh, you could just show Clark like in an airplane by himself, just like, well, I can't fly back myself, and I don't get to go back with Lois, so here's just Clark on a plane just by himself, just looking lonely and like, well, sometimes it's like this, but I saved Lois, so the end.
The end. Well, before we give our final rating for the episode, is there anything that we missed? Anything we didn't talk about with respect to this episode that you wanted to?
Yeah, so I made a few notes because we've been doing a lot of Phyllis Coates praising, and I just wanted to shout out that she's a fellow Texan. So she was born, or yeah, born not that far from where I currently live in Dallas, in a place called Wichita Falls. So that's pretty neat. Also, as I'm sure your listeners are well aware, she's the last surviving cast member, so she's still with us. And so, Phyllis, if you're listening, we love you. She is 96 and going strong, so good for her. Um, she was paid $375 per episode for the show, which I looked it up is $4,200 per episode in today's money.
It's insane.
Now I don't know what Bitsy gets, but I think it's more than $4,200 an episode.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, we know that um, this was not a big budget production, but still, do you know what George Reeves' salary was by any chance?
I didn't look that
No.
one up.
We'll dive into that. We'll probably do something when we get to the end of season one, and heading into season two. We might do some sort of retrospective or something like that, and any other tidbits and anything that I discover along the way. Maybe we'll kind of go back and mention something like that. We'll see.
Yeah.
But no, I appreciate that info. Yeah, I mean, such a wonderful Lois. I wish she could have been with the series all the way through, or at least through that second black and white season. But so it goes.
So it goes, and I couldn't tell you when I became aware of George Reeves' death because obviously everything I was seeing was posthumous. And so I was not, one of the kids who experienced his death at the time. And I kept thinking, preparing for this podcast tonight, like when did I know? And to be honest, I don't think I have a vivid memory of when I found out. And if I did, I think it didn't affect me the way that it did people of an older generation. So, like I said, I was watching these in 1972, which was 20 years after they aired. So I'm sure that I did find out. I'm sure that it struck me in some way. I think I have a vague memory of wondering, like, why did Superman give up? And I'm sure it was a much watered down version of that feeling than the kids, at the time. But I remember thinking that didn't make sense. That didn't make sense that Superman did that. And so I think I just filed it away as well. I don't understand it. Maybe I'll understand it later, but right now I don't understand it. Um, but I think I continued to watch the shows and enjoy them and learn from them because there were quite a few that were wonderful, and the overall impression that I had was just how Clark really believed that you could make a difference. And he would put up with just about anything. He would put up with Perry barking at him. He would put up with Lois nipping at him because, and I've heard you talk about this. I mean, he just was a stronger Clark. He wasn't interested in being. He wasn't interested in fooling anybody. He was there to to tackle things that you could tackle as a reporter in that day with the power that that wielded, where you could go in and ask the questions to the people that were trying to get out of answering them. And that was, I think my takeaway. But as much as I love rewatching them now, of course, there's the bittersweet element when you see George Reeves, and he kind of struggled enjoying the show himself and all those things. But I say all of that to say that it doesn't take away from his performance; it adds to it, because when you know all of that and you see what he did anyway, and when you learn later that it was because he truly wanted the children to have the Superman experience that they deserved to have, the way he treated them in public, the way he refused to do some things in the Superman costume, like he held the esteem of the American child, boy and girl, in such high regard that he overcame all of those things so that it wouldn't show. And you really, as you watch these, you so appreciate that more and more and more. And every person is complicated. Every person's life is a mix of things. But I have come to see him for those strong moments where he summoned it up because he thought American children deserve to see this done in this way, and I'm not going to let them down.
Beautifully said, and I think that's a wonderful way to look at it. Truly, I couldn't have said it better myself. So I'll leave it. I'll leave it at that. So the last thing that we do on these episodes is we give our rating on a scale of 1 to 5 fedoras. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how many would you give Treasure of the Incas?
So I almost want to cheat and ask if you've given out any fours yet.
There have been some 4s and 5s.
Have there?
There
Okay.
have been, yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah, I would give this a four, I think, because it had a mystery that was solvable. It had clues that paid off, which is the rules of a mystery. It had hero moments from Jimmy. It had an adventure in an exotic location that was different and interesting, and it kept you in it throughout the whole story. And in the end, the the justice thing that was supposed to have happened did happen. And you can only assume that the people of the town did receive the money from the treasure, which was donated. And so, more than just we stopped a criminal, this one ended with we helped an entire town. Had it not been for Lois saying, "This is my story, and I'm going all the way to Peru to pursue it," the people of that town might never have have had better lives. So for all of those reasons, including one of the better happy endings that we got, I would say a four.
Okay. I mean, I don't dispute your assessment or description of the episode. For me, it doesn't rise to a 4. I'm going to give this one a 3. This was, I would say, sort of average for me. I really liked the Jimmy of it all. Lois frustrated me, and I guess in terms of the mystery, I don't know. I'm kind of torn. I agree. It's like everything sort of, lines up and is solvable. I guess I felt like they gave away the assistant so easily to the audience, which is fine, but I don't know. I felt that was maybe a little bit too easy. And then I guess the not to complain about this, but at least you had Clark figuring out where the treasure could be. But other than that, like no one figured out anything. Which is okay, but I don't know. This was the last thing I was going to say. I feel like even though I enjoyed that scene with Perry, it lifts right out of the episode. What I would have done is instead of having that scene with Perry, I probably would have had a scene of Clark figuring out something that then sent him after Lois and Jim. That for me was a little bit of a missing piece here, and I think that might have fixed the episode a little bit for me. As much as I like that Perry scene, but I think just in terms of the overall structure of it, that's probably what I would have done. But anyway, for me, this was a 3.
Well, that's a really good point because what if Lois had bought the Pan Am tickets and just taken Jimmy and gone? And then Clark and Perry have to figure out, well, what do we do about that? And the answer is, well, you're going to have to go after her with everything that you know. That would have been pretty great.
Yeah, I think that would have worked. But again, as I always say, it's easy 70 years later to be like, oh, they should have done this. It's like, look, it was still an enjoyable episode and very enjoyable. A lot of fun to be able to talk about it with you. For anyone who wants to keep up with you and your Superman cosplay, I really encourage you follow at Wearing the Cape on Instagram. Is there anything else that you want to share with folks, or anywhere else you want to direct them?
Um, by the time this airs, the event will probably almost be upon us. But March 24th, 25th, and 26th, we're having the Christopher Reeve reunion of many of the surviving cast members that worked with him on the Donner films and also Superman 4, including Mark Pillow. Nuclear Man will be there in Richmond, Virginia at GalaxyCon. So I'll be lucky enough to be there as part of that gathering. So if nothing else, I'll post a lot of pictures. But if you happen to be in the area, if you happen to be able to go to GalaxyCon the weekend of March 24th, please do come. Please come say hi. Everyone is tremendously nice. You will not be sorry.
Well, this will air after that, but I'm sure people will be able to find photos and videos of the event. So I do encourage them to do that. And then again, by this will be about a mid-April episode or so. I have to check my calendar, but could you share the article, or the first article, I suppose, that will be coming out from you at dailyplanetdc.com?
Sure. And we can, I assume, edit all of the things that I just said that have been in the past.
No,
But
no, it's all good.
actually, Anthony, thanks to you inviting me to be on the prior show, our podcast was put on the front page of the Daily Planet DC.com website, and I had the honor of starting to talk to the editor in chief of the Daily Planet, and we got to talking about Superman and some of the more interesting things about his history. And I will very soon become a contributing writer myself for the Daily Planet. So there are very few things in life that are much cooler than actually growing up to be a reporter for the Daily Planet. And the first series that I will be doing is the Secret Spanish History of Superman. No surprise considering the topic of this episode, but there are a great many contributors, including Jose Luis Garcia Lopez and an entire plethora of amazing Spanish translation Superman comic books and memorabilia that are just wonderful to look at. But in essence, over the course of these four articles that I'm going to write, we'll see that Superman has been an amalgam of many cultures and the imaginations of people who have come from different parts of the world. And the reason that Superman is still universal and still resonates to so many people across the world is partially because he's been built and written and drawn and imagined by wonderful people. And some of them have left this legacy. So I wanted to start by examining the secret Spanish history of Superman.
That's fantastic. So I look forward to that, and I hope the audience will check that out. And again, like I said, if you haven't listened to Daniel's appearance on my other podcast, Digging for Kryptonite, I really encourage you to check it out. It was one of our first episodes of 2023. It's called Wearing the Cape and is available on all major podcast platforms. And the last thing I'll say before we sign off here is, you know, I didn't have you on for this episode because of your heritage and background. You know, we started talking fairly recently. I already had a lot of these episodes tagged to people, but then of course I found out about what a big fan of Adventures of Superman you are. And so when we ended that last recording, I was like, you know, if anything opens up in these season 1 recordings, of course you'll be top of mind. And that's exactly what happened. Some things shifted around. So it was just serendipity that this episode happened to be the one that opened up, and we were able to have you on, and it worked out perfectly.
Oh, yeah, I thought the exact same. Like sometimes fate just says, "Well, this will be perfect," and there's nothing to do but say yes. And let's talk to a friend about Superman and let's have an incredible time.
Absolutely. Well, this was a blast. I look forward to the next time you and I could talk. I thank you for participating. Audience, thank you so much. I always appreciate it. Make sure you come back in 2 weeks. Next time, it's Double Trouble. We'll have returning guest Rich Roney. So make sure you come back for that. Adventures await. This show is part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network, home to Digging for Kryptonite, another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman, Summoning the Zords, and My Comic Shop History, available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review today. Sign up at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato for additional content. Thank you all.